In the winter of 1871, deep in the shadow of Mount Cinder, an inferno consumed more than timber and stone. The flames that devoured Harker's Repose Inn burned with an intensity that locals claimed could be seen from 20 miles away, casting an orange glow against the black Tennessee mountains like a beacon from hell itself. The heat melted iron hinges and twisted metal tools into unrecognizable sculptures of torment. Witnesses spoke of hearing sounds from within the blaze that no wooden structure should produce, screams that seemed to echo from multiple throats before being swallowed by the roar of consuming fire. But this was no ordinary fire, and these were no ordinary victims. The official record speaks of tragedy, a faulty flue that claimed an entire family and their unfortunate guests. Newspaper accounts described the Harkers as simple mountain folk who operated a humble inn for weary travelers. Their deaths a reminder of winter's cruel indifference to human fragility. Yet whispered confessions from deathbeds tell a different story, one that local authorities buried beneath ash and convenient lies. 3 souls who had escaped the chains of slavery only to stumble into something far worse, a place where hospitality masked hunger and generosity concealed an appetite for human flesh. The truth that investigators discovered in those cooling ruins would challenge everything civilized people believed about the boundaries between survival and savagery. What no one realized was that the fire had been no accident at all. The discovery that would change everything was not that the Harkers were monsters, but that 3 desperate fugitives had engineered their own salvation through flames that turned predator into prey. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I'm about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. This was not just murder, this was an operation that had fed on human lives for years, until 3 desperate fugitives turned predator into prey and sanctuary into a pyre that would burn for 3 days straight, leaving behind evidence that would haunt investigators and secrets that authorities would spend decades trying to bury. The terrain itself was complicit in the horror that unfolded in Hollow County, Tennessee, where Cinder Pass carved its treacherous path through the Smoky Mountains like a wound in the earth's flesh. The pass wound between peaks that seemed to lean inward with malevolent intent, creating a natural funnel that trapped travelers in its narrow confines while winter storms raged overhead with biblical fury. For formerly enslaved persons fleeing the post-war chaos that still gripped the reconstructed South, these mountain paths offered invisibility, but demanded a price measured in blood and bone. The unofficial routes that carried desperate souls toward freedom followed deer trails and abandoned logging roads that became death traps when snow began to fall. Ice formed on exposed rocks like glass teeth waiting to tear flesh from unwary feet, while branches heavy with accumulated snow could snap without warning, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath them. The cold here possessed a viciousness that transcended mere weather, seeping through threadbare clothes and gnawing at exposed flesh with teeth sharper than any blade. Hypothermia claimed anonymous victims whose bodies would not be found until spring thaws revealed their frozen forms twisted into final poses that spoke of desperate struggles against inevitable death. Local folklore whispered of meet-ins scattered throughout the Appalachian wilderness, places where travelers vanished and innkeepers grew fat on profits that seemed inconsistent with their remote locations. Mountain folk spoke in hushed tones of families who never butchered livestock yet somehow maintained larders full of cured flesh that fed them through the harshest winters. These stories carried the weight of warning wrapped in superstition, dismissed by educated men as primitive nonsense born of isolation and ignorance. But educated men had never walked these paths in winter, had never felt the desperation that drove people to trust strangers whose smiles seemed too wide and whose hospitality felt too eager. They had never stood before the only light visible for 30 miles in any direction and been forced to choose between probable death from exposure and possible safety behind walls that might conceal horrors worse than freezing. In 1871, Harker's repose stood as that singular beacon of salvation, its candles glowing like stars in windows that faced the trail with deliberate invitation. Travelers knew its reputation as a safe haven, where coin could buy warmth, sustenance, and shelter from the merciless elements that ruled these heights with absolute authority. This was the landscape Abel, Cora, and Isaiah entered, desperate and freezing in the winter that would test everything they believed about survival, human nature, and the price of freedom. Abel carried the mark of his trade burned deep into his left forearm, a brand that identified him as property of the Whitmore Plantation Forge, where he had spent 15 years transforming raw iron into tools that built the wealth of men who considered him livestock. The scar tissue formed patterns that told the story of his skill, each burn a lesson learned in the dance between hammer and anvil that had made him invaluable to masters who never acknowledged his intelligence or humanity. His hands, permanently scarred by years of sparks and molten metal, possessed the intuitive understanding of fire and iron that would prove more valuable than he could imagine in the trials ahead. But more dangerous than his physical skills was the literacy he had acquired through midnight lessons, by stolen lamplight, reading forbidden books that opened his mind to possibilities beyond bondage and taught him that knowledge was the most potent weapon any enslaved person could possess. The wanted poster that bore his description offered $50 for his return, describing him as articulate and skilled, warning that he might attempt to pass as a free man among those who did not know his status. What the poster could not capture was the quiet intelligence that made him a natural leader, the fierce protective instincts that bound him to his chosen family, or the burning desire for freedom that had finally overcome years of calculated caution. Cora's needlework had once adorned the elaborate dresses of plantation wives who competed for social dominance through displays of wealth that depended on her invisible labor. Her keen eye for detail and fabric quality, developed through years of creating beauty she was forbidden to wear, had made her invaluable to women who never acknowledged her name or artistic vision. Every stitch she placed carried decades of suppressed creativity and enforced anonymity. Freedom had not dulled her observational skills. If anything, liberty had sharpened her ability to notice inconsistencies and anomalies that might threaten their safety. She possessed the seamstress instinct for dropped stitches and imperfect patterns, skills that translated into survival awareness that registered every detail that seemed out of place or deliberately concealed. Her distrust ran bone deep, earned through years of watching smiling faces conceal cruelty and learning that survival meant questioning every gesture of kindness until its true motives became clear. Isaiah's 20 years belied the strength that field labor had carved into his frame, muscles hardened by dawn to dusk work that had stolen his childhood but granted him resilience that older men envied. The trauma of chronic hunger haunted him like a ghost that whispered constantly of empty belly nights and meals that never came, creating an almost desperate gratitude for any offered food that worried his companions who understood how vulnerability could be weaponized by those with predatory intentions. His memories of plantation life centered around hunger, the gnawing emptiness that defined existence for those whose labor fed others while they survived on scraps and promises. This history made him dangerous in his eagerness to trust anyone who offered sustenance, his body's desperate needs overriding the caution that had kept him alive through years of bondage and months of dangerous travel. Together they formed a found family bound by trauma and sustained by hope that pulled them northward like a magnetic force. Their shared goal of reaching a rumored black settlement in Ohio, where former slaves had carved out lives beyond the reach of bounty hunters and night riders, gave meaning to every step that carried them further from familiar horrors toward an uncertain but self-determined future. Hope was a destination marked on no official map, but survival was a nightly chore that required decisions made with incomplete information and stakes measured in life and death. And tonight, it meant knocking on a strange door with frozen hands and empty stomachs, while winter wind howled through the darkness like the voices of all who had died seeking freedom. Silas Harker greeted them at the inn's heavy wooden door with the expansive warmth of a politician seeking votes, his smile stretching wide across features that suggested prosperity in a region where most families scraped by on subsistence farming and seasonal labor. His bulk spoke of regular meals and comfortable living that seemed inconsistent with operating an isolated mountain inn dependent on sporadic travelers for survival. The way he studied them reminded Cora uncomfortably of livestock buyers at market, measuring value with glances that lingered too long on their physical condition and traveling possessions. His pale eyes remained flat and calculating even as his voice boomed with artificial joviality, creating a disconnect between performance and genuine feeling that set warning bells ringing in minds trained to recognize danger disguised as kindness. His clothes showed quality that raised quiet questions about the true source of his prosperity. The wool of his coat carried the fine weave that spoke of expensive materials, while his leather boots showed craftsmanship that exceeded local standards by significant margins. These details suggested income streams that transcended what any legitimate inn could generate in such a remote location. Maud Harker embodied maternal abundance with deliberate precision, her plump figure moving through the common room with practiced efficiency that spoke of years spent perfecting her role as the welcoming hostess. Her voice carried honey-sweet tones of Southern hospitality, yet something in her manner suggested performance rather than genuine warmth, as if she had studied the behaviors of truly caring women and learned to mimic them for purposes that had nothing to do with actual nurturing. She watched everything with small, bright eyes that missed nothing, cataloging details about their appearance, possessions, and physical condition with an intensity that felt predatory rather than hospitable. The way she ladled stew suggested someone accustomed to calculating portions and measuring responses, as if feeding guests required careful consideration of ratios and timing that went beyond simple nourishment. The twins, Elias and Ebenezer, towered over their parents in uncomfortable silence that seemed to fill the room with unspoken tension. Their massive frames appeared designed specifically for heavy manual labor, muscles developed through work that required both strength and endurance applied over extended periods. They moved with the synchronized precision of men accustomed to working together on tasks that demanded perfect coordination. When they took the travelers' meager belongings for safekeeping, their hands lingered on the bundles as if estimating weight and contents for purposes that remained unclear but felt somehow significant. Their communication relied on glances and subtle gestures that excluded outsiders, creating the impression of shared knowledge that visitors were not meant to understand or question. The inn itself struck all three visitors as strangely prosperous for such a remote location. The furniture showed quality craftsmanship that suggested substantial investment in comfort and appearance, while the larder seemed remarkably well stocked for a business that theoretically depended on unpredictable traveler traffic. Multiple oil lamps burned with lavishness that indicated abundant fuel supplies, creating warmth and light that felt almost theatrical in its abundance. The stew they served carried flavors that seemed too complex for simple mountain fare, seasoned with herbs and spices that suggested sophisticated knowledge of food preparation and access to ingredients that should have been difficult to obtain in such an isolated location. Isaiah ate with desperate gratitude while Abel and Cora exchanged meaningful glances, their survival instincts whispering warnings that contradicted their desperate need for shelter and sustenance. For the first time in weeks, their bellies were full and their bodies warmed by genuine heat. But a new, subtler hunger for answers began to grow as inconsistencies accumulated into patterns that demanded explanation. The locket caught Cora's attention during their second evening at the inn, its delicate silver chain glinting at Maud's throat as she served their supper with the same theatrical precision that characterized all her interactions with guests. The engraved floral pattern sparked recognition that sent ice through Cora's veins. She had seen that exact piece worn by Martha, a fellow traveler they had encountered weeks earlier on the dangerous trail north. Martha had spoken of the locket as her grandmother's only legacy, something passed down through 3 generations of women who had somehow managed to keep this single beautiful object through slavery, war, and the chaos that followed. She had touched it constantly while speaking of her plans to reach family in Philadelphia, treating it as both talisman and treasure that represented everything she hoped to preserve from her past. When Cora carefully inquired about the lovely piece, complimenting its craftsmanship with the genuine appreciation of someone who understood fine metalwork, Maud's demeanor shifted subtly but unmistakably. The honey-sweet voice carried a sharp edge as she claimed to have purchased it from a peddler who had passed through several weeks earlier, her explanation delivered with the careful precision of someone reciting a rehearsed story. The way her hand moved protectively to cover the locket suggested defensive awareness that went beyond normal attachment to personal jewelry. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Cora's face for signs of recognition or suspicion, creating a moment of tension that felt charged with unspoken understanding and mutual wariness. Abel's blacksmith training had conditioned him to notice details that others might overlook, particularly the excessive number of heavy locks securing interior doors throughout the inn. These were not the simple wooden latches or basic iron mechanisms expected in a rustic guest house, but substantial security devices designed to prevent unauthorized access with serious intent. The metalwork showed quality that seemed inconsistent with rural craftsmanship, suggesting either significant expense or specialized knowledge in their selection and installation. Each lock appeared chosen for specific purposes, some designed to keep things in, while others seemed intended to keep intruders out, creating a complex security system that raised questions about what exactly required such elaborate protection. Isaiah's natural curiosity about his surroundings led him to explore the inn's layout during their second afternoon, his field labor background having taught him to understand buildings through their practical functions and structural logic. When he approached a door that presumably provided access to the cellar storage areas, he found himself roughly redirected by Ebenezer's massive hand on his shoulder. The twins' grip conveyed unmistakable warning without requiring words, steering the young man away from the door with force that left no room for argument or negotiation. The incident happened quickly enough that it might have been dismissed as simple boundary setting between proprietor and guest, yet something in Ebenezer's eyes suggested significance that transcended normal hospitality protocols. That night, as they lay in their shared room, listening to the wind howl through the mountain passes, a distant metallic scraping drifted up from somewhere deep within the building's lower levels. The sound carried the rhythm of deliberate work, metal against metal in patterns that spoke of sharpening and preparation rather than casual maintenance or repair activities. The noise continued for hours, stopping and starting with mechanical precision that suggested tools being maintained for specific purposes that required particular attention to sharpness and functionality. Each resumption of the scraping carried undertones that made sleep difficult, and dreams, when they came, filled with images of blades and cutting implements being prepared for unknown but somehow sinister applications. The kindness of the Harkers was a veneer applied over something much darker, and it was beginning to crack under the weight of accumulating inconsistencies that demanded explanation. Abel's feigned illness the following morning provided the opportunity he needed to investigate, while his companions assumed he rested in their shared room, recovering from what appeared to be a reaction to rich food after weeks of near starvation. His blacksmith training had taught him patience in working with resistant materials, skills that translated perfectly to the delicate manipulation of lock mechanisms using improvised tools. A nail pulled from a loose floorboard served as his lockpick, its iron responding to pressure and angle adjustments, with the familiar resistance patterns he understood from metalworking. The mechanism on Silas's office door yielded to persistence and skill after 20 minutes of careful probing, revealing a space that contradicted everything about the Harkers' presentation as simple mountain hospitality providers. The office contained furnishings that spoke of education and prosperity, far beyond what any legitimate inn could generate in such a remote location. Books lined shelves with titles that suggested interests in anatomy, preservation techniques, and business practices that seemed oddly sophisticated for rustic innkeepers. A collection of maps marked various trails and passes throughout the region, with notations that appeared to track travel patterns and seasonal variations in traffic flow. Silas's ledger lay open on his desk, its pages filled with entries that told a story of impossible prosperity built on supply purchases that made no sense for any legitimate food service operation. Purchase records showed massive quantities of salt, vinegar, and wooden barrels, materials that suggested preservation work on an industrial scale that far exceeded the needs of occasional travelers seeking simple meals and basic accommodation. The salt purchases alone represented quantities sufficient to cure entire herds of livestock. Yet nowhere in the accounts could Abel find evidence of cattle, pig, or sheep acquisitions that would justify such massive preservation supplies. No hunting licenses appeared in the records, no trade agreements with local farmers, no documentation of any legitimate protein source that could account for the meat that clearly stocked their larder in such abundance. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard behind the desk, wrapped in oiled cloth that protected it from moisture and discovery, Abel found a second menu written in Silas's careful hand. Unlike the simple fare advertised to arriving guests, this document listed special cuts with names that chilled Abel's blood and challenged his understanding of what any restaurant might dare to serve. Traveler's Choice, Wayfarer's Portion, and Drifter's Delicacy appeared alongside prices that indicated a clientele willing to pay premium rates for these mysterious selections. The descriptions used terminology that seemed to reference cuts of meat that no legitimate butcher would recognize, while preparation methods suggested cooking techniques that transcended normal culinary practice. Meanwhile, Cora's discovery emerged through her seamstress instincts, while mending a tear in Elias's heavy winter coat, her needle finding resistance in fabric that should have accepted thread. Easily caught in the wool's weave, she discovered strands of long blonde hair that matched neither the twins' dark locks nor their parents' graying heads, hair that suggested a young woman who had been close enough to the garment for her hair to become entangled during what must have been violent physical contact. The hair's quality and length indicated someone who had maintained personal grooming standards despite the hardships of travel, suggesting a person of some refinement rather than the rough travelers who typically frequented mountain inns. The way the strands had become woven into the fabric spoke of struggle and resistance rather than casual contact, creating implications that made Cora's hands shake as she carefully extracted each blonde thread. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture that defied their desperate need to believe in sanctuary and safety. The special menu represented human travelers who had trusted the Harkers' hospitality. The inn served as an elaborate trap designed to capture and process victims, and the family had refined their operation into a systematic machine that maximized both profit and efficient disposal of evidence. More disturbing was the realization that this operation had functioned for years, claiming countless victims whose disappearances went unnoticed in the chaos of post-war displacement and reconstruction. They were not the first desperate souls to mistake this place for salvation, and unless something changed dramatically, they would certainly not be the last to pay the ultimate price for trusting appearances over instincts. They were not guests seeking temporary shelter. They were inventory awaiting processing in a machine designed to consume human lives, and the Harkers were preparing to restock their larder with fresh supplies. The announcement came during their third evening when Silas proclaimed with theatrical pride that tomorrow would feature a special meal prepared in honor of a merchant who was expected to arrive before nightfall. His manner carried the excitement of a man anticipating a rare treat, his pale eyes gleaming with anticipation that sent warning signals through every survival instinct Abel had developed during years of bondage and months of dangerous travel. The timing felt deliberately orchestrated to coincide with their extended stay, as if their presence had somehow triggered preparations for an event that required specific scheduling and coordination. Silas spoke of the meal with the reverence typically reserved for religious celebrations or significant anniversaries, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that felt more sinister than hospitable. Maud's reaction to her husband's announcement revealed excitement that seemed disproportionate to the prospect of serving food to a single additional guest. Her movements became more animated, her voice carried undertones of barely contained eagerness, and her eyes held a brightness that suggested anticipation of pleasures that transcended normal hospitality satisfaction. Panic drove Abel to attempt what he knew carried enormous risks, slipping from the inn under cover of darkness to seek help or confirmation of their fears from someone who might provide perspective on the Harkers' true nature. The climb to Mountain Mary's cabin tested his strength against frozen mountain paths where each step risked exposure and death from bitter cold that ruled these heights with absolute authority after sunset. The journey required following deer trails that became treacherous ribbons of ice in darkness, relieved only by starlight filtered through bare branches that created shadow patterns like grasping fingers. His breath formed clouds that seemed to hang in the still air, long enough to mark his passage, while his footsteps echoed with sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the mountain silence. Mountain Mary's dwelling perched precariously on a rocky outcrop that commanded views of the entire valley, while remaining virtually invisible to casual observers below. The cabin was protected by symbols carved into fence posts and bundles of dried plants that spoke of knowledge older than Christian doctrine, traditions that had somehow survived attempts to erase them through conversion and education. Mary refused to open her heavy wooden door, speaking instead through the barrier with a voice that carried decades of hard-earned wisdom and carefully maintained isolation. Her words emerged as whispers that seemed to blend with wind sounds, creating the impression that the mountain itself was sharing secrets too dangerous for normal conversation. The herb woman's confirmation of their worst suspicions came with matter-of-fact delivery that suggested someone who had witnessed unthinkable things and learned to discuss them without emotional investment. The Harkers, she explained in her mountain dialect, were meat-eaters who had haunted the holler for longer than most people remembered, predators who had learned to disguise their true nature behind facades of hospitality and Christian charity. They did not raise their own livestock, she whispered through the door. They simply procured it from the steady stream of travelers who trusted their reputation for safety and fair dealing. The procurement process, she implied, without stating directly, involved methods that ensured their supplies remained fresh, while eliminating any possibility of complaints or negative reviews from dissatisfied customers. Her revelation that no guest who stayed for the special meal was ever seen again carried the weight of absolute certainty based on years of careful observation. Mary had watched the pattern repeat countless times, travelers arriving desperate and trusting, then vanishing as completely as if the mountain itself had opened to swallow them whole, leaving no trace except for personal belongings that occasionally appeared in the Harkers' possession. She offered no help beyond knowledge, her own survival, dependent on maintaining the careful distance that had kept her alive, while others fed the Harkers' appetites through misplaced trust and desperate circumstances. The warning she provided came wrapped in resignation that acknowledged the likely futility of resistance, as if 3 more souls would inevitably join the countless others whose bones enriched the mountain soil around the inn's foundation. Abel returned to the repose not with hope of rescue or outside intervention, but with a desperate plan that would require courage, intelligence, and coordination that could easily result in their deaths if any element failed to execute perfectly. Their careful investigation had not gone unnoticed by hosts whose survival depended on monitoring guest behavior for signs of suspicion or resistance. Abel's return from his nocturnal expedition revealed Silas and his sons confronting Cora and Isaiah in their room, the travelers' meager possessions scattered across the floor like evidence being cataloged at a crime scene. The friendly facade had evaporated completely, replaced by cold calculation that assessed them as problems requiring immediate solution rather than guests deserving continued hospitality. Silas's transformation was both complete and terrifying, his politician's smile replaced by the flat expression of a predator who no longer needed to maintain pretense of civilized behavior. His voice carried new authority as he observed with clinical detachment that they seemed uncommonly curious about matters that did not concern paying guests seeking simple accommodation. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with threat and certainty of consequences that would be both swift and final. The twins moved with practiced efficiency that suggested this confrontation followed a script refined through countless repetitions. Elias secured Abel while Ebenezer gathered their scattered belongings, their movements economical and professional, in ways that spoke of extensive experience handling reluctant inventory that required physical restraint and psychological intimidation. Resistance proved futile against their combined mass and coordination, Abel's blacksmith strength insignificant compared to the overwhelming force represented by 2 men whose lives had been dedicated to physical labor that exceeded normal human capacity. Their hands felt like iron shackles impossible to break or slip, while their synchronized movements eliminated any possibility of escape through speed or surprise. The journey to their ultimate destination revealed the inn's true architecture, a maze of locked doors and narrow passages designed to funnel victims toward chambers that served purposes far removed from simple storage or guest accommodation. The wooden steps descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their oil lamp's feeble glow, leading to spaces that had been constructed with intentions that transcended normal architectural requirements. Each descending step carried them further from the world of normal human interaction into spaces where different rules applied, and civilized behavior became not just unnecessary, but actually counterproductive. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying odors that combined preservation chemicals, organic decay, and something indefinably wrong that seemed to cling to their clothing and hair. Their prison was a root cellar adjacent to the main larder, separated by iron bars that allowed them to observe the Harkers' true workshop, while preventing any interference with its operation. Through the gaps between metal uprights, they witnessed hooks suspended from ceiling beams like grotesque ornaments, cutting tables scarred by years of use that told stories no civilized person wanted to understand. Barrels of salt stood arranged with mathematical precision that spoke of industrial organization applied to activities that defied normal business classification. The tools displayed on wooden walls had been maintained with care that suggested both professional pride and regular use, their edges reflecting lamplight with the deadly gleam of instruments, kept sharp for purposes that required cutting efficiency beyond normal culinary applications. The damp stone floor beneath them felt slick with substances they preferred not to identify, while scratches and stains on the walls suggested previous occupants who had not accepted their fate with the resignation the Harkers clearly expected. They were trapped in the belly of a beast that had consumed countless other victims, surrounded by evidence that made resistance seem both futile and necessary. Trapped in the belly of the beast, they had only one advantage that their captors had not considered. The Harkers saw them as prey rather than predators, never imagining that three desperate people might possess the intelligence and courage to transform their prison into a trap that would consume their captors instead. Imprisonment focused their minds with desperate clarity that transformed panic into methodical planning, each of them contributing specialized skills developed through years of forced labor that their captors had not considered as potential weapons. Abel used a piece of coal from the cellar's cold brazier to mark the stone walls, creating charts that tracked the Harkers' routines with the same precision his blacksmith training had taught him to apply to complex forging projects. The marks revealed patterns that spoke of established procedure rather than improvised cruelty, feeding times and inspection visits that followed schedules suggesting the family operated their grim business with industrial efficiency that maximized both profit and victim processing capacity. Understanding these rhythms provided their only hope of identifying opportunities for escape or reversal of their seemingly hopeless situation. Morning brought Maud with thin gruel and water, her movements quick and efficient as she checked their physical condition with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating livestock readiness for slaughter. Midday saw Elias delivering additional water while inspecting their restraints, his massive hands testing knots and examining metal components with thoroughness that spoke of professional concern for security protocols. Evening brought Silas himself, accompanied by Ebenezer carrying tools that gleamed with recent sharpening, their purpose unmistakable to anyone who had witnessed butchering operations on plantations where meat processing required both skill and appropriate equipment. His visits lasted longest, combining psychological intimidation with physical measurement that felt like final preparation for activities scheduled to commence soon. Cora applied her seamstress skills to the lock mechanism securing their cell door, using a hairpin straightened into a makeshift pick, while Abel provided whispered guidance based on his metalworking knowledge of how internal components responded to pressure and manipulation. The delicate work required patience that seemed impossible under their circumstances, yet their survival depended on mastering security devices designed specifically to prevent exactly what they were attempting. The mechanism proved more complex than simple plantation locks, its internal components arranged with sophistication that suggested either expensive purchase or skilled modification by someone who understood advanced security principles. Each attempt provided information about internal configuration, building knowledge that brought them incrementally closer to success, despite setbacks and false starts that consumed precious time. Isaiah tested every surface within reach, his field labor strength revealing weaknesses that might be exploited given sufficient leverage and determination applied over extended periods. The air vent near the ceiling showed promise, its iron bars old enough to have developed the subtle looseness that could be expanded into escape opportunity through persistent pressure applied at correct angles. Stone walls proved solid beyond any possibility of breakthrough, but mortar between blocks showed signs of age-related deterioration that might yield to concentrated effort with improvised tools. Floor stones displayed similar characteristics, some slightly loose in their settings, creating possibilities for weapon acquisition if they could work quietly enough to avoid detection during daily inspection visits. Their planning revealed a crucial advantage that their captors had not anticipated. Tomorrow's special meal would require the family's complete attention to prepare and serve properly, according to standards that clearly exceeded normal hospitality requirements. The merchant's arrival would create distractions and opportunities that might never come again. A window of chaos during which three desperate people could become something more dangerous than victims. The realization that shaped their strategy was both profound and liberating. They were not planning simple escape that would leave the Harkers free to continue their predatory operations with future victims. Instead, they were planning complete eradication of a system that had consumed countless innocent lives through carefully cultivated trust and manufactured hospitality that concealed appetites no civilized society could tolerate. They had identified their window of opportunity and developed a plan that was less about escape and more about turning the Harkers' own methods and environment against them in ways that would ensure this particular machine of death could never claim another victim. The merchant's arrival shortly after dusk created exactly the distraction they needed, his voice carrying through the building's wooden walls as he discussed special requirements and pricing that confirmed their worst suspicions about the inn's true clientele and the nature of its most exclusive culinary offerings. His familiarity with the establishment suggested regular patronage rather than chance discovery, while his specific requests indicated knowledge of services that no legitimate restaurant would advertise. Negotiations continued in the main room, where all four Harkers focused their complete attention on arrangements that demanded careful coordination between food preparation, timing, and discreet service that would leave no witnesses or evidence of activities that transcended normal hospitality. Their voices carried undertones of excitement and anticipation that spoke of shared participation in rituals that had been refined through years of repetition. Cora's persistence with the lock mechanism finally yielded success when internal components aligned properly under pressure that had been gradually increased over hours of patient manipulation. The soft click sounded impossibly loud in their stone prison, yet their guards' attention remained focused on more important matters that required their presence elsewhere in the building. Freedom brought no relief, only the terrifying responsibility of executing a plan that offered no margin for error or possibility of second chances if any element failed to proceed according to precise timing requirements. They moved with silent coordination of people whose lives depended on perfect synchronization, each action calculated to support overall strategy while avoiding detection that would doom them all. Abel's knowledge of metalworking proved crucial as he examined the main cellar door's locking mechanism from the outside, identifying internal components that could be disabled using tools appropriated from the Harkers' own workshop. Heavy hammers and iron rods designed for butchering operations served equally well for sabotaging security devices, his blacksmith understanding allowing him to jam internal gears with precision that would prevent opening regardless of key availability or applied force. The destruction had to appear accidental to outside observers while remaining absolutely certain in its effectiveness, requiring damage patterns that suggested mechanical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. Each component he disabled was chosen for maximum impact on overall system function, creating cascading failures that would make repair impossible without complete replacement of major elements. Isaiah created the diversion they needed by deliberately triggering a collapse in the storage pantry, his field labor experience having taught him exactly how to bring down supporting structures in ways that appeared accidental while serving specific tactical purposes. The crash of falling goods and wooden shelving drew both twins away from their parents to investigate the disturbance, their heavy footsteps thundering across wooden floors as they responded to what seemed like simple clumsiness. His performance as confused victim of circumstantial accident convinced them that no deliberate sabotage had occurred. Their attention focused on damage assessment and cleanup, rather than security concerns that might have revealed the true purpose behind the apparently random destruction. Their irritation at his supposed carelessness provided additional cover for activities occurring elsewhere in the building. The moment of truth arrived as they herded their former captors into the main hall, where the merchant waited with eager anticipation for services that would never be provided. Silas's confusion at finding his cellar door jammed gave way to alarm as he realized that his family's carefully controlled environment had been compromised by people he had dismissed as helpless victims. Abel's prepared kindling and appropriated lamp oil transformed the building's wooden construction into fuel for the inferno they were about to unleash. Years of accumulated cooking oils, preservation chemicals, and seasoned timber combining into combustible materials that would burn with intensity sufficient to destroy all evidence of the Harkers' crimes, along with their ability to commit future atrocities. The final act required courage that transcended their circumstances and personal safety. Abel throwing the lit lamp onto their prepared pyre, while the Harkers' frantic shouts echoed from within walls that had become their tomb rather than their fortress. The flames caught with explosive violence that exceeded even his blacksmith understanding of fire behavior, transforming the structure into a conflagration that could be seen from valleys 30 miles away. They stood watching the inferno consume Harker's repose with fascination that mixed horror and satisfaction, witnessing the destruction of a machine that had processed human lives like a mill grinding grain, finally silenced by victims who had refused to accept their assigned role in someone else's nightmare of profit and predation. They had emerged not as arsonists driven by revenge, but as survivors who had turned the tools of their oppression against their oppressors through intelligence, courage, and desperate determination that transformed them from prey into agents of justice that civilized society had failed to provide. Their escape northward carried them through mountain passes that seemed to exhale relief, each mile separating them from the horror that continued burning behind them like a beacon of justice visible across the entire mountain region for 3 days and nights. The three fugitives pushed through exhaustion and bitter cold, driven by knowledge that their survival depended on reaching sanctuary before their absence was discovered and connections made between their presence and the catastrophic fire. The flames had consumed more than the Harkers and their victim processing facility. The intensity had destroyed evidence that might have exposed the full scope of operations that had claimed countless lives over years of systematic predation disguised as mountain hospitality. What remained in the cooling ashes would tell only part of the story, leaving room for official interpretation that served interests beyond simple truth-telling. Sheriff Josiah Crockett's investigation began 5 days later, when reports of the massive conflagration could no longer be ignored by county authorities, whose jurisdiction included responsibility for maintaining order and investigating crimes that threatened community stability. His examination of the ruins revealed evidence that should have prompted extensive investigation, yet his official actions suggested a man more interested in reaching convenient conclusions than discovering uncomfortable truths. The ledger had survived the fire, its metal clasps and thick leather binding protecting Silas's careful records from complete destruction while leaving pages readable enough to reveal the impossible supply purchases and financial arrangements that made no sense for any legitimate hospitality business. Crockett read these documents with growing unease, studying entries that challenged his understanding of normal commercial operations in ways that demanded explanation. The hidden menu, partially damaged but still legible, provided additional evidence of services that no respectable establishment would dare advertise to legitimate customers seeking conventional meals and accommodation. Its cryptic listings and premium pricing suggested clientele willing to pay extraordinary rates for offerings that transcended normal culinary categories in ways that raised disturbing questions about the inn's true purpose. Mountain Mary's testimony, when he bothered to collect it, provided first-hand accounts of suspicious activities and disappeared travelers that spanned years of operation under his jurisdiction. Her detailed knowledge of the Harkers' true nature offered insights that could have exposed systematic murder disguised as business enterprise, yet Crockett's report would later relegate her statements to the unreliable ravings of an isolated hermit whose mental state compromised the credibility of her observations. The revelation that transformed understanding of the entire situation was not investigative incompetence or bureaucratic laziness, but deliberate suppression of evidence that threatened interests larger than individual justice or community safety. The existence of a cannibal family operating with impunity on a major travel route reflected poorly on county law enforcement, territorial governance, and the broader reconstruction effort to establish functional civil authority in previously rebellious regions. Acknowledging the full truth would have required admitting that local authorities had failed catastrophically in their most basic responsibility to protect vulnerable travelers from predators who had operated under their noses for years. It would have meant confronting the reality that the chaos of post-war displacement had created opportunities for horrors that civilized society preferred to deny rather than address through systematic reform. The cover-up served institutional interests that transcended justice for individual victims, protecting reputations and career prospects of officials whose competence would be questioned by revelations of systematic failure to recognize and stop obvious criminal activity. The convenient lie preserved social order at the expense of honoring those whose deaths had been ignored or explained away through willful blindness. The truth was not lost through accident or incompetence. It was deliberately filed away under more convenient explanations that protected everyone except the victims whose voices had been permanently silenced. The town of Jericho Fork accepted Sheriff Crockett's conclusions with relief that allowed residents to resume normal life without confronting uncomfortable questions about collective complicity and willful blindness to obvious signs of criminal activity that had operated in their midst for years. The official story of accidental fire provided closure that truth would have made impossible, preserving community peace at the expense of honoring victims whose names were never recorded in any public document. Local newspapers printed brief accounts that emphasized the tragedy of lives lost to winter's cruel indifference, portraying the Harkers as hard-working mountain folk whose deaths reminded readers of frontier life's inherent dangers rather than human evil that had flourished through systematic deception. These articles became the foundation for historical memory that would shape understanding for generations that never learned the true nature of what had been destroyed in that terrible fire. Harker's repose became ruins left to mountain weather and encroaching wilderness, its blackened stones gradually disappearing beneath vines and seasonal growth that seemed eager to erase all evidence of human habitation from a site that nature itself appeared to reject. The foundation remained visible for several decades, but travelers learned to avoid the location that carried an atmosphere of wrongness that even animals seemed to recognize and shun. Wild creatures that had once moved freely through the area began taking alternate routes that avoided the burned ground, their instincts apparently detecting chemical changes in soil that had been enriched by human decomposition and the charred remains of the inn's final victims. Plant growth in the immediate vicinity showed abnormal characteristics, producing flowers with unusual colors and vegetables with bitter flavors that local families refused to harvest or consume. Abel, Cora, and Isaiah reached the Ohio settlement after weeks of careful travel that tested their endurance against winter conditions and constant fear of discovery by bounty hunters who might connect them to the mysterious fire that had dominated regional news for months. Their shared trauma created bonds that would endure lifetimes, while their secret remained locked in silence that survival demanded they maintain regardless of personal cost. They built new lives under assumed names that allowed them to disappear into communities of former slaves who understood the necessity of reinvention for people whose pasts contained experiences that could not be safely shared with those who had never faced similar choices between death and resistance. Their true identities became buried as deeply as the history they had helped create, through desperate courage and determined refusal to become victims. The official version entered local folklore stripped of its human heroes and genuine victims, reduced to ghost story elements that focused on mysterious fires and supernatural explanations, rather than celebrating three people who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through intelligence and coordinated action. Their agency disappeared from popular narrative, replaced by mystical forces that required no uncomfortable moral reckonings from listeners. Years passed before the first curiosity seekers began visiting the site, drawn by stories that had evolved through generations of retelling into entertainment that bore little resemblance to historical truth. They searched for paranormal evidence while missing the real horror that had operated through systematic cruelty, rather than supernatural forces beyond human responsibility or understanding. The transformation from documented atrocity to local legend represented institutional amnesia that protected established interests while dishonoring everyone who had suffered at the Harkers' hands, turning genuine heroism into mysterious happenings that required no response from civilized society beyond momentary fascination with the macabre details that had survived the sanitization process. But the land retained memory longer than human institutions, and the records, despite official reinterpretation, preserved evidence that patient researchers might someday discover and restore to its proper context within the larger story of survival and resistance that defined the African American experience during Reconstruction. Contemporary paranormal investigators arrive at the site armed with electronic equipment designed to detect electromagnetic anomalies they interpret as ghostly manifestations rather than evidence of historical trauma that continues to affect the physical environment through perfectly natural processes. Their instruments register disturbances that have rational explanations rooted in soil chemistry, altered by massive human decomposition and metallic debris buried beneath decades of forest growth and seasonal accumulation. Digital thermometers record temperature variations that reflect underground air currents flowing through spaces where the inn's cellar operations left voids in the earth, while EMF detectors spike near locations where the Harkers' iron tools corroded into mineral deposits that create measurable electromagnetic fields. These readings support supernatural theories while missing the mundane horror that actually occurred on ground that still bears chemical signatures of industrial-scale butchery. Some visitors report olfactory hallucinations of cooking meat on empty air, their subconscious minds responding to chemical traces that persist in soil enriched by the Harkers' victims and the charred remains of their final feast. These sensory experiences carry psychological weight that transcends simple imagination, connecting modern tourists to historical reality through biological responses they cannot consciously explain or control. The phenomenon creates genuine unease that validates ghost story interpretations while obscuring the human courage and intelligence that had ended the Harkers' reign of terror through deliberate action rather than supernatural intervention. Visitors seek evidence of restless spirits while standing on ground sanctified by three people who had refused to accept their designated role as victims in someone else's profit-making scheme. Online communities dedicated to dark tourism have adopted Harker's Repose as a destination that promises authentic supernatural encounters, their discussions perpetuating romantic versions of events that bear little resemblance to the systematic predation that actually occurred. Forum posts focus on equipment readings and personal experiences, while ignoring historical context that would honor actual victims and their unlikely saviors. The modern obsession with paranormal explanation reflects broader cultural reluctance to confront historical realities that challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature, institutional reliability, and the effectiveness of official law enforcement in protecting society's most vulnerable members. It remains easier to believe in ghosts than acknowledge that three formerly enslaved persons displayed more moral courage than the entire governmental system of their era. Social media amplifies these misinterpretations through viral posts that emphasize supernatural drama while erasing the political dimensions of a story that reveals uncomfortable truths about whose lives mattered to authorities charged with maintaining order and dispensing justice. The real horror becomes entertainment that requires no moral response from audiences seeking momentary thrills rather than historical understanding. Before I continue with the final truth, if you're finding this story as deeply unsettling as I am, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the other buried histories we're bringing to light. Stories that reveal how often the official record protects the comfortable by forgetting the brave. The horror remains embedded in the landscape and the incomplete records, even if the reasons for both the crimes and the heroism have been systematically forgotten through generations of willful mismemory that serves interests far removed from truth or justice. The official record remains a monument to institutional cowardice disguised as administrative efficiency, its neat conclusions protecting reputations that were built on the unmarked graves of forgotten victims, whose deaths were explained away through convenient lies that served everyone except those who had died seeking nothing more than basic human dignity. Sheriff Crockett's report stands as testimony to the lengths authorities will travel to avoid confronting inconvenient truths that threaten established narratives of competence and moral authority. Every document that survived the fire and subsequent investigation tells the same story when examined honestly. The Harkers operated a systematic murder enterprise that processed human beings like livestock, while local authorities either failed to notice obvious evidence or chose to ignore clear signs of criminal activity that demanded immediate intervention. The salt purchases alone should have triggered investigation, yet official curiosity remained focused elsewhere. The fire that consumed Harker's Repose was not the accidental tragedy described in newspaper accounts that portrayed simple mountain folk as victims of winter's cruel indifference, but a deliberate act of justice executed by three people who understood that survival sometimes requires becoming the very force that others fear to face. They transformed from hunted prey to active predators not through choice, but through necessity that left no alternative except death or revolutionary resistance. Their success required intelligence, courage, and coordination that transcended individual survival instincts to become collective action that protected not only themselves, but countless future victims who would have died if the Harkers had been allowed to continue their profitable operations. The machine they destroyed had been designed to consume the most vulnerable members of society while generating wealth for those who understood how to profit from human desperation. The Harkers were not victims of unfortunate circumstances or accidental fire, but architects of systematic horror who had refined murder into routine business practice that fed on social displacement and official indifference to the fate of people whose disappearances generated no investigation or public concern. Their deaths represented natural conclusion to a cycle they had initiated through predatory choices that made violence inevitable. Abel, Korah, and Isaiah were not unfortunate travelers who perished alongside their hosts in a tragic accident, but heroes who refused to accept their assigned role in someone else's nightmare of exploitation and consumption. When faced with a system designed to devour them, they chose to burn it down rather than submit to becoming fuel for its continued operation, their agency challenging comfortable assumptions about helplessness and predetermined outcomes. The silence that surrounds their true story reflects broader patterns of historical erasure that protect institutional interests at the expense of individual courage and sacrifice that deserves recognition rather than systematic forgetting. Their names disappeared from official memory not because their actions were unimportant, but because acknowledging their heroism would require confronting uncomfortable questions about the society that forced them to choose between death and revolution. The most frightening truth revealed by this story is not that the Harkers existed and operated with impunity for years, but that the system which created and protected them continues to function through different mechanisms that still sacrifice the vulnerable to preserve the comfortable, still prioritize institutional reputation over individual justice, still choose convenient lies over inconvenient truths that demand moral response from those with power to create change. Some silences are not empty spaces, waiting to be filled with speculation and supernatural explanation. They are deliberately maintained voids that contain answers. We remain too afraid to hear because understanding would require acknowledging our own complicity in systems that continue to consume the powerless while protecting the privileged through willful blindness disguised as respectability and order. If this story has shown you something about the power of those history chose to forget, the courage of people who refuse to remain victims, and the necessity of remembering truths that authorities prefer to bury, subscribe to ensure you don't miss the other suppressed stories we're bringing from shadows into light. Because the past is not dead, it lives in every system that prioritizes comfort over justice, convenience over truth,